you have to think of, and I think this is a little overstated, but you have to think of what the state of horror was in the 1990s, the late 90s, right? Because there's movements in horror and they change, but like in the 80s, slasher movies were huge, and then there were too many of them, and there were too many sequels, and then so that kind of died out, and then Scream comes out, and slashers are back, and it's funny, it's kind of like how I mentioned The Ring and The Grudge are like the only movies that anyone remembers and talks about when they talk about the American remakes of the J-horror movies. I think similarly, Scream and maybe a few other movies are like the only movies anyone remembers or talks about from like the 90s slasher movies, but just know that there were a lot of them, and most of them were utter garbage. Scream is awesome. Urban Legend's okay. I Know What You Did Last Summer's okay. But, so this movie is cited as like a push towards like making more suspenseful horror movies that didn't have a lot of violence and gore and stuff like that. And I don't know how accurate that is, but that's supposedly one of this movie's influences. Also, I'll say, and this is, again, because the American remake is kind of part of this, but this movie is not an R-rated film, and obviously neither is the American remake. The American remake is famously the one movie people talk about when they talk about like PG-13 horror can be good. They'll always go back to The Ring. But that actually, I think you see a dip in quality in mainstream horror at a certain point, I think because they kept just making PG-13 horror movies. And most of them suck. And it's more recently, like in the last 6 or 7 years, I think we've kind of gotten away from that. We're making R-rated horror movies again. Get Out, because we've seen, The Ring was a huge hit and it was a PG-13 horror movie. And now we've seen that R-rated horror movies can still be really successful. The Halloween movies, the recent Halloween movies, like, I think we're away from this garbage PG-13 crap, and we're making R-rated movies again. So that's kind of nice, but this is probably influential for that. I'm not going to blame this movie for the shitty PG-13 horror movies we got in the 21st century, but, probably somewhat of an influence.